Hi team, welcome to the first of the lectures in the nutrition series. This lecture is going to introduce the topic of nutrition and then we'll move on to carbohydrates, which is the first of our major macronutrients. Quite a long topic, this one, so we'll break it into a couple of parts just to ensure you're not sitting here for too long in one hit. In the face-to-face classes we would spend 3 to 4 lessons on this particular area here. So buckle up and we'll crack into it. So through the course we're going to be looking at these major 6 subjects here, starting with the macros, the big players, that's carbs, protein and fat. We'll be looking at what they are, the different types of them, where we find them in the foods that we eat, and their functions within the human body. And then we'll start to culminate that information into the second point there, fueling and exercise. So we'll look at when we should eat them around the time of exercise and the pre-workout, during and post-workout phases to maximize our performance and recovery. We'll then be looking at micronutrients, that's vitamins and minerals, and how they unlock the potential of the macros and some of the other roles they have in the human body. We'll spend some time looking at fluids and hydration, making sure we maximize again our body's ability to work out at reasonable intensities for decent amounts of time, and it's not only dependent on fuel but the level of hydration within the body. Once we've got the basics down, we'll move into more dietary analysis, and that starts with your ability to read labels and understand what's stated on them, and along with that understanding be able to teach other people how to look at the pitfalls, I guess, that people fall into around labels, how manufacturers maybe try to pull the wool over our eyes a little, and effectively be able to make good choices when it comes to the foods that we're eating. This will all culminate in the final section, which is performing a dietary analysis, where we'll analyse someone's diet in class and produce an eating plan for that person based on their dietary needs. So that would include obviously the amount of exercise and their weight goals that they have. So a pretty full nutrition subject, and should leave you with some really usable information and some quality techniques that you can take out and start applying to your clients. As we go through, we'll be introduced to a whole lot of different information, but the key thing going forward is that we always remember these overriding themes. Okay, so these key themes that we're going to introduce now will override everything else that you come across. So I will be introducing you to some new trends and new fads, also some current science, and everything should be able to relate back to these overriding themes. So when you check the quality of the information that you're getting, if it doesn't abide by these sort of overriding themes, then you might want to question the source of that information and the quality of that information. The first one is this: energy in minus energy out equals energy stored. It's really the first law of thermodynamics, which means that if you consume X amount of calories and you don't burn X amount of calories, then the excessive calories that you've consumed will stay on your body. And if you consume less calories than your body burns, then the odds are that you will lose body mass through that process. Now there are some caveats in amongst that, and those are some of the things that we're going to be discussing as we go through the topic. So what is energy in? Energy in is of course the things that you eat and drink. It's also the amount of the things that you eat and drink. So the type of food, and not all calories are the same. We'll learn that as we get into the macros. We'll learn that fat in particular has double and more the calorie density of a gram of protein and carbohydrates. And we'll also talk a little bit about sugar and how the body views that a little bit differently, and how calories that we might eat are not always equal. The amount of food we eat is obviously very important. The total amount of caloric intake will largely determine the mass of a person over time. And then of course the quality of food. Are we actually getting health benefits from that food that we're eating? It's very easy to eat calories, but do we eat quality foods that provide those key micronutrients that help us with bodily functions? So before we go on, I guess, what is a calorie? Now again, in the Prezi that you can look through at your own pace, you'll see this video here, and it's a basic video about what is 200 calories look like on a plate. The basic or underlying theme of this video is that the denser the food in terms of its sugar content, its fat content, etc., the higher the calorie content. The more water a food has, typically the less calorie content per unit of weight of that food, because water, of course, has very few calories. So fruits and vegetables full of water typically have very little calorie content, compared with something like a hamburger or a hot dog or some fish and chips, which are very dense in nature and have a lot of fat associated with them, which would of course raise the calorie count. So we're not going to watch that video on this. You can look through that at your own pace if you go back to the Prezi file on the Moodle page and walk through it at your own pace. And then we have energy out, and exercise is one of the ways in which we burn energy. You can see it at the bottom there, but there are a number of other ways as well that can affect your energy output. Number one, certain foods actually create a thermic effect. The actual digestion and absorption of those foods costs energy. Okay, so typically the longer that food would stay in the gut, the more thermic effect it would have. Basal metabolic rate is your body's baseline for calorie requirements to maintain the mass that it currently has. So that's you lying down for the entire day over a 24-hour period, and that will tell you how many basic calories your body needs just to maintain the mass that it has without doing any activity. And then we have this NEAT factor, which I'll introduce during the weight loss segment of our studies. And NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so the burning of calories through stuff that we wouldn't class as a workout. This is your daily activity sort of level, the number of steps you take, how often you're on your feet, how active you are in your role at work or study, will determine your NEAT factor, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So typically people that are on their feet for large parts of the day have a higher NEAT value and would maintain more, I guess, desirable body weights than those who sit for longer periods of time. And there is a direct correlation between the number of hours that we sit and our morbidity, meaning that the longer you sit on average in terms of hours a day, the shorter your lifespan is going to be. And then the final one is exercise, and exercise is hugely important. Yes, if exercise is done effectively, you can burn a considerable amount of calories, but actually the NEAT calories over the course of the day could outweigh exercise 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 if you're actively thinking about ways of keeping your body moving rather than sitting still for long periods of time. So those are all factors that can affect the energy in and energy out, and we haven't even talked about a lot of those excuses that you hear when it comes to weight loss, like, you know, my high or low metabolism, you know, my genetics and those kind of things. And those are all things that we will come back to, but the variance dependent on or caused by those sort of variables such as genetics and so on are actually quite small in the scheme of things when we consider the energy in energy out context there. The other aspect we want to consider is who are we talking about when it comes to nutrition. You know, when we're discussing an athlete versus a stay-at-home sedentary person, someone who doesn't get out and about and involve themselves in sport and activity, we're talking about two very different vehicles there. So your body is an amazing vehicle. Some people have a very finely tuned vehicle, which is more used to burning calories, and we could call those people, I guess, fat burners rather than fat storers. And then other people have actually trained their body to become a very good storage unit for fat because they don't actively burn a lot of calories during the day. From a performance perspective, we have to understand that if we underfuel our machine, our body, then it can't produce the maximal results that we're looking for. In every training we go to, we should be trying to maximize our performance output so that we achieve those gains that we're always striving for. Otherwise, we're going to the gym and going out on that sports field and going to those trainings, and we're not actually improving. We're just going through the motions, and that it's largely based on the amount of fuel that's available to your body and the type of fuel that's available to your body. So we'll learn a bit more about that. The basic rule of thumb is you need to eat enough to meet your exercise needs. If you eat too little, you will definitely impede performance. And when you eat, certain foods will also impact on performance and recovery. And this is a a shifting scale depending on the type of sport and the type of person you are and your body type, etc. But actually we overcomplicate this sometimes. It's a lot simpler than people think. If we adhere by a few simple rules, we can maximize our performance every time we step into the training arena, and then we can maximize our recovery after. And once we learn these simple rules, you'll definitely feel the benefits of this information, okay, once you apply it on yourself. And that's the first place we start. You try it yourself, and then you start passing this information on to other people, because you'll truly believe it once you've tried it yourself. The other overriding theme, I guess, revolves around what should I be eating? And that really depends on who you are. So if you look at that scale from, I guess, muscular and quite thin at the left-hand side of this picture over here, right through to the obese character on the end here, a very unhealthy body type here, well, what they should be eating is vastly different because of A, what they do, and B, what type of body they have. So it depends on who you are and what your goals are. That's the first thing we need to be asking our clients. So if you're overweight, what are the overriding goals of a nutrition program? The first one has to be staying full without eating too many calories. In fact, the only way you're going to lose weight is to create a calorie deficit, meaning you eat less than your body requires to maintain its current tissue. So staying full is obviously going to play a big part in that, and that's where protein-rich diets come in. There'll be more discussion around this when we talk about protein as a macronutrient. The other thing, of course, is to avoid those known danger foods. To get obese, you have had to eat a considerable amount of calories over and above what your body requires to maintain its status. Okay, and you need to do that on a daily basis, effectively. And the way in which those calories creep up is where we have those danger foods where we just can't stop eating them. And we've all got them. The difference is, I guess, that in a normal weight person, they either make a change to their lifestyle where they burn more calories, knowingly doing exercise, etc., to enable them to eat those types of foods on occasion, or they just simply show greater willpower when it comes to those foods. And if they haven't got their willpower, they simply avoid them by not putting them within arm's reach. If you know you can't stop eating a certain food, then don't buy those foods and stick them in the house where they're readily available all the time. Okay, so an overweight person's goals when it comes to nutrition may be very different to another group of people. Well, what about a group of people that just want to stay healthy? What do they need to think about in their diet? Well, the first thing you probably think of these whole foods, which contain a lot of vitamins and minerals, fiber, some good oils, and keeping the salt down. So these are people, I guess, that may not present as hugely obese on the outside. They may not eat too much food even. They may just be eating the wrong foods over a period of time and become internally very unhealthy. So in the industry they're often known as toffees, T-O-F-I, which is thin on the outside but fat on the inside. So these people need to revert back to whole foods. They need to be eating those good vitamins and minerals in them, vegetables, fruit, grains, etc. Some good monounsaturated fats, which will help to reduce their cholesterol and cardiovascular event risk, and of course the salt as well, which plays a part in cardiovascular risk as well. So eating for health, again, has a very different set of rules as opposed to eating for weight loss, and of course the final one here, which is the athlete. So what's the main goal of the athlete? Well, when we look at an obese person, we're not really asking the question, are they eating enough? We know they're eating enough. They're eating too much on a regular basis. But a lot of athletes that we might deal with, maybe they're not eating enough. Okay, so they're slim. They may have an element of muscle to them and that kind of thing, and they've got their own performance-based goals that they're working towards. But at this point, are they achieving? Are their numbers going up in the gym? Are their times coming down? Are they standing out in their sport? And is it fuel that is a limiting factor there? They're doing a lot of training, but are they actually eating enough to maximize that training? Now, if you're not eating enough and you're training hard, will the training feel very difficult? Well, of course it will. It'll feel more difficult than it would if you were actually fueled. But it's more about exercise output. So a lot of people go to the gym and don't eat. They go for their workout, they might go for their run, and they think, well, if I don't eat, and then I train, well, it's a double whammy effect, isn't it? I haven't taken in any calories, I'm going to burn calories, and therefore I get the double whammy benefit of that. Unfortunately, if you don't eat before you train, then the amount of training that you can actually manage is far less than it would be if you were fueled. The intensity you can maintain is far less than it would be if you were well fueled, and therefore the caloric burn that you actually achieve might be very minimal in a session, hampered by the fact that you don't have enough available fuel. The type and amount of exercise will determine how much food and what type of food you need to eat in the preceding hours before training. So if you're just going out for a 30-minute jog, then you don't need to carb load effectively for that sort of type of session. But if you're playing a full 90-minute game of football, then you would essentially want to make sure that your glycogen levels are full in the body. The fuller they are, then the longer you're going to be able to play at higher intensity, and the longer you preserve your intensity levels and don't succumb to fatigue. Now, there's no question that this is better done on a carb-rich diet, and all athletes that actually want to achieve high performance at any type of intensity that you would call a meaningful intensity need to be on a carb-rich diet. And that takes preparation, and that's the thing where a lot of young athletes in particular let themselves down. They're just not prepared enough. They haven't bought the right foods. The right foods aren't on hand either before training or, even more importantly, after training. You know, a lot of people leave the gym and think, I've done all the hard work now, so I can go and eat whatever I want. And they actually sabotage that recovery process by eating the wrong things at the wrong time. So we'll be discussing a lot around that. So, where do we start? With this topic, first we need to understand a little more about what is going into our bodies. And we're going to start by looking at the big players, and that is carbs, fat, and protein. They're known as the macronutrients. Okay, so everyone has their own thoughts on carbs, fats, and proteins. If I sat here and asked you, for example, which one of these is bad for you? The answer is none of them are bad for you. Okay, there are definitely a lot of people in the anti-carb market at the moment that seem to think that carbs are the root of all evil when it comes to weight gain and all that kind of stuff. If you'd gone 10, 15 years ago, then everyone was on fats bandwagon and how fat's so bad. Okay. Lately, there's been a large emphasis on protein intake and how protein intake is the way forward. Okay, so again, before we jump on any bandwagon, we can't just apply the same rule of thumb to everybody. You can't sit there and say that carbs are bad for you when an athlete needs a hell of a lot of carbs to perform adequately. You also can't say that fat is bad for you. It's vital in many internal processes within the body. So we need to get some clearer understanding about this stuff before we can A, disseminate that good information out there among the general populace, and B, when we hear people talk about this, very fervently about what they believe, actually apply our abilities to use judgment based on what we've learned to not correct, but take what they're saying with either a grain of salt or maybe lead some discussion around, yes, but who are we talking about? And that's the question we'll always come back to is, you say this is bad or you say this is good, for who? Explain yourself. Why do we believe this is bad, and why do you believe it's bad, and particularly for yourself or for a certain group of people? And that's what we're going to take this education forward and disseminate that good info among people so they can start making good and rational food choices. So carbs, that's where we start today. There's no question that these are the preferred fuel source for the human body. Okay, and yes, they can be dangerous in the wrong hands. They can be dangerous in the wrong amounts and at the wrong times. An easy way to think about carbohydrate needs is when there is demand or no demand in the body. So if there is demand for carbohydrates in the body, we'd have to ask ourselves, well, when is that going to be and why? And demand for carbohydrates is only really active when you are doing something, when you're actively performing an activity of some intensity, or be after you've performed something. Okay, and after you've performed something, there will be an active demand within the body to replace the fuel that you used. And that would lead a lot of people to think, well, so I don't eat it in the prelim to exercise because there's no demand. But of course you're going to want to use carbohydrates during the exercise, and in order to do that you need to fill up your carb stores. So is there a need for carbohydrates in the pre-exercise window? The answer is absolutely. If you want to fill up those carb stores to have carbs available for the exercise that you're about to do, then of course you need to put them in there first. Now carbohydrates, what are they? Well, they're made up of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. And you see the three first letters of these guys spells CHO. And if you see CHO, C-H-O, written at any point during future presentations, that is an acceptable abbreviation for carbohydrate. So what does it do in the body? Pretty simply, it's just the most accessible source of energy for everything in the body, for our muscles, and also for our essential organs, particularly the brain. You actually need a small amount of carbohydrate in the system to combust fat, and fat is often used alongside carbohydrates in lower intensity aerobic type exercise. Now when we get into fat, we will talk about the use of removal of carbs from the diet to encourage your body to burn fat. But again, who are we talking about? Are we talking about a muscular bodybuilder who's trying to cut? Are we talking about a weight loss client, a pure weight loss client, or are we talking about an athlete? And again, fasted exercise, one thing we do know is that your performance is going to suck effectively. You're going to not have carbs available. You're going to go out and it is going to be very tough, but yes, you might be able to promote more use of fat as a fuel source over time. And that could have really beneficial effects to someone used in the right format. But I can tell you now, it isn't the right format for performance gains. So, let's start by breaking down carbohydrates into their structural classifications. And there are two ways in which we can classify carbs. First by structure, and then secondly by how they act. And these do overlap somewhat, but we've got to be a lot clearer about the distinction of these two things here. So the two constructs we're going to be using here are something called simple versus complex carbs, which I'm sure you've heard those terms before. And on the other side of the coin, by function, we're going to be talking about GI, the glycemic index. And there's some strong links between these two. Let's start with simple carbs versus complex carbs. Now, there's a little video, again, on your full Prezi. If you were walking through this at your own pace, you can watch that video in your own time. It'll just talk you through the structural classification and why they exist. Okay, it'll also show you some examples of different foods. You can have a look at that video. But essentially, simple carbohydrates are known as monosaccharides. And the thing that distinguishes them from complex carbs is that they have single bonds between the sugar molecules. So if you have a glucose molecule bound to another glucose molecule with a single bond, now that's a lot easier to break down than multiple bonds for the enzymes that would come in and remove those bonds and free the sugar up. So the only simple carbohydrates that we deal with in food effectively are glucose, fructose and galactose. Now glucose is known as blood sugar when it's within the body, it's in the blood, and then we usually try to store that in our muscles and liver as something called glycogen, which is glucose packed very closely together with more glucose molecules. Now we don't just sit around spooning glucose into our bodies, so we derive glucose from the carbohydrates that we eat. So that could be breads, that could be pastas, that could be rice, that could be starchy potatoes, it could be flour-based products. Glucose comes in a variety of form and they're not all sweet. It's really important to remember that the body views glucose, whether from a starchy source or from a grain-based source or from a sugar, a sweeter sugary-based source, as the same thing, regardless of whether it's sweet or not. When sugar is sweet in the products that we eat and gives a very sweet nature to food, it's usually the fructose component within it here. So fructose is the sweetest of all sugars and naturally occurs in fruits. Now, we might take that naturally occurring fruit and condense it into something known as high fructose syrup. So this fructose syrup is something that a lot of companies use when they're making mass-produced stuff that they want to get maximum sweetness into, but they don't want to just add sugar effectively. So this glucose syrup is an easy way to do that. The difference between glucose and fructose is that fructose is not as easily dealt with in the body as glucose. Glucose absorbs very quickly into the bloodstream, raises our blood sugar, and then gets transported around the body as blood glucose. Whereas fructose, in its first port of call in the liver, actually often gets converted into fat. Okay, and that can lead to fat later around our organs and within our liver itself. Galactose is a simple sugar that's found in milk. Okay, so these are simple sugars, but none of these alone is what we know of as sugar. So sugar is actually a disaccharide, so technically a complex carbohydrate, but we're never going to think of table sugar as a complex carb. We're going to actually think of it as a simple carb because it's very easily broken down and it is a mixture of glucose and fructose. Some simple carb food examples for you here, things that we should be able to recognize. So we've got dried fruit, whereas fruit itself, with its fiber component, etc., is actually a complex carb. When you dry it like a raisin, you condense that sugar, and it's easily broken up. It becomes a simple carb. Juices that are extracted from the actual fibrous fruit are themselves simple carbs. Sports drinks and soft drinks, actual table sugar we'll think of as a simple carb. Jams and honey and things made out of that simple sugar. And then things that are not necessarily sweet, like white rice, just a refined product that's had the fibrous layer removed. Anything made from white flour would be considered a simple sugar. So our breads, our pastas, our muffins, crumpets, and all those kind of things, including rice flours as well, so things like rice crackers and that kind of thing would all be simple carbs. Whereas complex carbs have multiple bonds, which requires more chemical breakdown. Okay, so while table sugar, or sucrose, is effectively a complex carb, we're never going to think of it that way. Okay, so the true carbs that we're going to think of as complex carbohydrates are going to be these guys here, the polysaccharides. They contain glucose, but they have these other components to them which effectively trap the glucose and make it harder for the enzymes to get to, and therefore often they can delay the emptying process in the gut. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose in the human body, tightly packed glucose molecules. Starch is one of the complex carbohydrates we often eat in the form of starchy vegetables such as potatoes and kumaras, and even pumpkin to a degree. And then this word here down the bottom, fiber, is really what differentiates a lot of whole foods from refined foods. The fibrous structural part of the plant, which can't be broken down by the gut, so traps other molecules like glucose and like fats within its sort of tendrils of fiber, and therefore slows the whole process down of emptying into the gut and bloodstream. Some good examples of complex carbs include things like whole grain pastas and rice, whole grain breads, whole wheat breakfast cereals. Okay, easy way to think about it: if you have to do some work on it in your mouth, then your gut is going to have to do some work on it to extract the glucose that it's looking for. And similarly with the fruits, the fibrous nature of most fruits means that the fructose within is trapped in those fibrous tendrils, and therefore it takes a little bit longer to free up that stuff. So fruit is most definitely a complex carbohydrate, as are vegetables. The next couple of slides just give you some 20-gram carb portions. So here are some starchy ones. I'm not going to go through them all. This is for you when you're building your dietary plans. You can go in and you can actually find these sort of amounts to suggest and make that planning process easier. Here are some fruit and milk, 20-gram portions. And then we've got to look at, well, how does it actually get into our body? So we're starting to move towards the secondary classification of carbs, which is glycemic index. And that's about how quickly does it have an effect on the system? How quickly do the sugars become available to the body for use? So carbs actually enter the system the quickest of anything. In the mouth, we chew and we add enzymes through saliva, and then we swallow that food down to the stomach into an acidic environment. And in the small intestine, that's where we pass the glucose molecules through the wall of the small intestine and into the bloodstream. Fiber will delay that digestion, and that's why the complex carbs have an effect in the gut of slowing down the release of those carbohydrates. In the large intestine, we've basically got nothing left that we want in that food, just what's been trapped by the fiber. And depending on what you've eaten and how much, that could be between 1 and 4 hours before the food is entering that large intestine, and then it will spend another up to 10 hours making its way through the large intestine before it's brought out the other end. Fiber will help that process and quicken that process so that you can exit the waste a lot more efficiently. So we chuck it in the mouth and we start to break it down. The saliva goes to work starting to break apart those single bonds, and if we at that point had put in simple carbs, you'd find these things are breaking down pretty quickly. A small amount of glucose can actually be absorbed in the mouth. Down to the stomach, where the stomach churns food through muscular wave-like movements called peristalsis, and then the chemical digestion occurs within the acids of the stomach. Food ultimately becomes a paste and then moves through into the small intestine where the major digestion of our sugars occurs here. So this is where we absorb through the intestine wall. As we mentioned, fiber delays digestion somewhat. So this is one video I will watch alongside you here because I think it's a very vital part of the process of understanding digestion and absorption. So it's a little video here of a man who's going to be eating a burger, and we're going to follow the nutrients from eating into the bloodstream here. So here's a little man here eating a burger. And you just have to bear with me while the video sort of moves on. So he starts the breakdown process, the ingestion and digestion now, as we use our teeth and tongue to start breaking down that food. And the presence of food within the mouth and the chewing motion releases saliva. And you can see that sort of washing in now. So the enzymes within that saliva will help the passageway of food down the esophagus and also start the breakdown process of some of those singular bonds. Move it towards the back of the mouth. And we should see that food swallowed. Food now makes its way down the esophagus and is going to plop into the bag of acid that we know as the stomach. So here we obviously have a very simple and small portion of food. You'll see that the acid starts to go to work pretty quickly, and then the wave-like process of peristalsis helps break apart the food particles, and then we'll move it towards the entrance of the small intestine here. So this could take between 1 and 4 hours, depending on how much and what type of food you have there. At this point, we go past the bile duct, and bile is squirted in. So bile's job is to help with the breakdown of fat, which may not have fully happened by the time that it's entered the duodenum, or the first part of the small intestine. Here it is moving through that first part of the small intestine. We're still working on the food and breaking it into its component parts. And we'll dive inside the intestine now. And here we can see inside the intestine these larger brown blobs are fiber. And you'll see the green nutrients and the yellow nutrients there. So the green represents carbohydrate and protein, and the yellow represents fat molecules, or smaller fat molecules. The next thing that will happen is you'll start to see some of these molecules stick to the walls of the intestine. So as we pass through, you can see they're sticking on the wall of the intestine now, and just the fiber and the water is making its way through to the large intestine to be excreted. So if we peer a little deeper into the wall of the small intestine, you have to excuse the movie, it's doing its little stop and start type thing, but we'll bear with it. We're going to dive into the wall of the small intestine, and we'll see that it's actually not a flat surface, but made up of millions of these tiny finger-like villi that we find here. And each one of these little finger-like structures has its own blood network. So you'll see in a moment as it dives in, it has red blood arriving, which is keeping it alive, and it has blue blood leaving, but that blue blood that is leaving is going to be taking with it the key nutrients that we want to extract. Again, we're on our freeze mode here, so hopefully this keeps moving. Here we see the blood vessel inside, so we see the red blood arriving, and then we see the nutrients entering. So we're going to see the green nutrients enter the bloodstream and be transported off here. And then what you'll also notice is the yellow fat particles are going down the middle here through something called a lacteal. We don't want all of the fat that we consume to enter our bloodstream immediately, so that's continuing to be worked on. It's actually going towards the lymphatic system to keep breakdown going. Now here all of this blood is making its way up towards this key organ here, the liver. And the liver is going to cleanse that blood and also fill up its stores of carbohydrate in the form of liver glycogen. And after it's been through there, the blood will take it out to the rest of the body. So whenever we talk about absorption, whenever we talk about how quickly something absorbs and gets into our bloodstream, it's that process of getting through the stomach, getting through the wall of the small intestine and into the bloodstream, off to the liver, and then out into the body so that the body can utilize that fuel. How quickly that is happening will depend on the GI of food. So the liver, blood circulates through the liver, the blood is cleansed, and the glucose can be stored as glycogen for later use. We're filling up that reservoir. An easy way to think about it is if the muscles are the supermarkets and the dairies and shops where we can get our fuel from, then the liver is foodstuffs, where it all goes to first and then later distributed off to those places. Really important slide for us here. Where do we store carbs in the body? So those three key places. We know now that we store it as liver glycogen. We fill up that reservoir first. Then we hope to circulate some blood glucose around to our muscles to fill up our muscles for exercise. Our brain will use a little bit. Everything else will use a little bit. But in terms of storage, those are the two key places. And if excess glucose is still floating around the bloodstream, once those places are full, then we will store the rest as adipose tissue, which is body fat. Now, one other thing that's important on this slide is this bit up the top here, and this is why carbs has quite a negative, there's quite a negative feeling towards it in terms of weight loss or weight gain, and that's because every gram of carbs that you store within the body, you'll store 3 grams or mils of water alongside it, which is not great for weight and can lead to sort of bloating and those kind of things. But remember, it is water weight. And for exercise, that water will be very useful. That extra level of hydration will be great when it's released when you start to break down these carbs. So certainly nothing to worry about from an athlete perspective. So within 1 to 4 hours, we've got most of what we want out of the food. The rest of it is continued along the 9-meter alimentary canal, so getting into the large intestine where the fibre attracts a bit more water, and then we pass it out of the body. So anything I want to talk about down here, this explains the same sort of process we've just been through, but some fibre is excreted in feces, but very little other dietary carbohydrate is present. And that means that if you eat lots of carbohydrates, then you either need to burn those calories, or you are going to store the excess carbohydrate calories as body fat. Okay, so that's the structure of carbohydrate. The second classification, which we'll end this lecture on, is how do those carbs act and how quickly do they get into the bloodstream. And this is where GI comes into play. So it would be easy to assume that most simple carbs are high GI, meaning they clear into the bloodstream very quickly. And if you were eating them in isolation, I guess that would be true. If you were eating sugar, you were smashing a V energy drink, then very quickly you start to feel the effects of that as the sugar makes its way very quickly into the bloodstream. But we don't often just eat carbohydrate, and that's where GI can get a little bit murky in terms of understanding. So there are some other factors that can affect how quickly things clear the gut. Now what we're looking at here on this graph is we see two different scenarios here. In the yellow we see an increase in blood glucose followed by a slow and prolonged decrease of blood glucose back towards resting levels. Now that would be the effect that low GI foods would have on our system. As they clear more slowly, they don't raise our blood glucose levels as high, and they lead to more sustained energy. Okay, so as that, yes, of course, that those glucose levels will drop over hours of time, but they won't drop rapidly, and they certainly won't drop to a point where we get hypoglycemic down here. Whereas if you look at this one, this person has smashed a whole lot of sugar, which has raised their blood glucose levels really, really high. That's led to a very quick depletion of blood glucose, which has actually steeply gone below, after that sort of 1 to 2 hour mark, where we'd like to see it. Now, if we think about why we're eating this food and why the hours matter down the bottom here, this could be a classic situation of pre-exercise eating. Now, what we'd like to see is carbohydrates rise and then slowly diminish in the bloodstream, but as a reflection that those carbs have been taken up by muscles around the body. So we haven't lost those carbohydrates. Yes, the blood sugars have started to diminish a little, but we've stored it in our liver and we've stored it in our muscles, and that's ready to use now as we sort of hit towards that 2 hour mark. On the other side of the coin, we have a hell of a lot of sugar or glucose available to the body at this point, but that was only after 30 minutes after eating. And if we were eating that 2 hours prior to exercise, you can see what's going to happen. It's going to drop, and when we actually start exercise, we're going to be hypoglycemic, and that usually leads to feelings of lethargy and fatigue and that kind of stuff. So it's not an ideal situation. There's a double whammy at play here as well, because what we've found is that when you take your blood glucose levels so high, you get what's called an insulin response or an insulin rebound. Insulin is a hormone that's produced when glucose enters the bloodstream, and in this case it panics somewhat and it just looks to clear glucose out of the bloodstream as quickly as possible. Now the fastest way to do that as it enters the bloodstream from the small intestine is simply to open the fat cells surrounding your gut and just pack it in there. Let's get it out of the bloodstream, because we don't like our bloodstream to be too high in sugar. So this is called an insulin response, and this is something we definitely want to avoid in the hours before exercise. So to finish this lecture, let's just crack in and have a look at the difference in these two things. So it's important you understand that not all carbs clear the small intestine at the same rate. That the rate at which carbs clear the gut can be affected by the following things. Number one, yes, simple and complex carbs, when eaten in isolation, can have an effect. And typically complex carbs will clear slower than simple carbs. So typically, simple carbs have a higher GI than complex carbs when the carbs are eaten in isolation. But the major factor that affects GI, other than the type of carbs, is what else is in the food that you're eating. So the addition of fat and protein to carbohydrate dramatically slows down the quickness with which those carbs become available to our body. So fat or protein mixed in with the carbohydrates will make it much more difficult to free those glucose molecules quickly, and therefore could actually result in a food being low GI, even if it's full of sugar. So if we think of a classic situation of something that's high in carbs but also very high in fat or protein, we could think of something like a deep fried donut. So soaked up all the fat within it, it's still full of sugar, but the fat and the sugar combined will clear the gut more slowly than if we were to eat a piece of white bread with honey, let's say, which is all carbohydrates and low fat. We can also affect the way in which the carbs free from the body by the way in which we cook or prepare it. So, almost all carbs, whether complex or simple, if you eat them in isolation, they'll still clear relatively quickly. But when you add in that fat and protein, you'll delay that gastric emptying rate. And for this reason, not all simple carbs can be thought of as high GI. If they contain fat and protein, then they could be medium or low GI foods. So this is where the glycemic index comes in. The test is quite simple. 50 grams of carbs and we look at how quickly after you've fasted, when you eat this 50 grams of carbs, how quickly those carbs become available in the bloodstream. We do that through a blood test. Low GI would be 55 or less, medium GI 56 to 69, high GI 70 or more. Now the typical GI chart, if you were to look it up online, you can see thousands of food listed using glucose as 100. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't sit around eating glucose by the spoonful, so that doesn't really resonate with a lot of people. What does that mean? So the chart that I provided you guys with shows things against a piece of white bread, where white bread is 100. And we can make a lot more distinctions, or we can understand a lot better if we eat bread what that might look like. So if you look down here where you see glucose at 138, then bread, white bread, is 100. So let's have a look at some of the things in here. Now there's a lot of things that you might think, well, they're full of white flour and sugar, a lot of these things, sponge cake and donuts and those kind of things. And again, depending on the fat amount, and this one can't have a lot of fat in it to be at 108, but you can see that it's a hell of a lot lower than it would be if it was just white flour and sugar, which would be getting up more towards this sort of 138 factor here. You add in bran and fibre, and suddenly that thing comes down a bunch. Okay, looking at the cereals here, you've got your all bran here. That's those little, look like little poos of insects. 60, so full of fibre. Whereas cornflakes, which have been ground to corn flour and re-established as flakes, 119, so much higher. Oat bran again lower, and you can see that most of our easily broken down cereals are quite high. I don't think many people are going to sit around eating barley straight off the stalk, but you can see that's very low. You'd have to do a lot of work on that. White rice at 81, brown rice at 79, not a huge difference there. Instant rice would be more about your cream rice scenario there with some sugar whacked in there as well. We go down into here, you can see most of the dairies, even though they're full of sugar, they're also full of protein and fat, a lot of these things, so that's why they're not up over the 100 mark. And then fruits typically low, except for those ones that are really easily broken down and super sweet, such as watermelon and pineapple being quite high, and of course raisins and that dried fruit capacity as well. Legumes and beans, all very low. Interestingly, in the vegetable scenario here, that carrots and potatoes, carrots there are about the same as a piece of white bread. Quite an easily digested fruit, and it has a sweet taste to it. And then that's the potatoes there as well, baked potato, which is, you remember, goes quite soft once it's been baked. And the longer we cook something, obviously, the less digestion we have to do. Peas and corn, yep, traditionally quite low GIs, and we know that about corn in particular, its fibrous outer layer is usually present at the end of the process as well. And then we get down to the snack foods here, and again jelly beans and lollies and rice cakes and things that are easily digestible. You can see there at much higher GIs. So we start to get a sense of what clears quickly and what doesn't, and it's pretty simple really. When you look at a peanut, high protein, high fat, it has a much lower clearance rate there. So why does that glucose response even matter? Because of the insulin response, as I mentioned before. A rapid increase in blood glucose triggers that insulin response, that panic response, and that can cause rebound hypoglycemia. Now, if you're just sitting around doing nothing, that'll make you feel really hungry again quite quickly, which will mean you'll usually eat more. The other big problem with it is that insulin is also known as the fat storing hormone in this case. Because it wants to clear the bloodstream of excess glucose, the quickest way to do that, as I mentioned, is to open fat cells around the gut and just pack it in there. And that's why belly fat effectively is the easiest to lay down and the hardest to lose. Because every time you muck up, every time you have a binge on these types of food and that insulin response happens, then the body is more than willing to lay that down as belly fat. So again, we've got the two different scenarios here, but this one also shows insulin in yellow that you can see there. So in the first one, blood glucose raises with our slowly digested carbs, or our lower GI carbs. And you can see insulin also raises. And insulin does have a vital role in this process of energy storage. Not only does it open the fat cells to pour them in, the excess calories into fat, but it also opens muscle cells when there isn't a demand present, as long as that panic scenario is avoided. So you'll see blood glucose raises, but insulin raises as well, but to a lesser degree, and it ends up leveling out as the glucose is allowed to circulate around the body, reaches the muscles, and then insulin actually acts as a key to get the glucose into the muscle, and that eventually lowers your blood glucose at a much steadier rate, but more importantly means those glucose molecules are there for your use later in the muscle. Here we have the high spike in glucose followed by a sharp spike in insulin, and of course the concurrent blood glucose drop that leads to hypoglycemia a few hours later, which is not ideal in the pre-eating phase before exercise. Okay, so another little video here. Here we go. So insulin and glucose. This little video just shows us the role of insulin in the body. So what you see here flowing through the blood vessel, minus the blood cells, is the little white dots, which are glucose, and the little flowers, which are insulin. Whenever you see glucose in the bloodstream, you'll also see insulin in a well-functioning system. So we've just talked through this process where the glucose is broken down, and this glucose now is passed through the small intestine wall and is floating in the bloodstream as glucose. The pancreas is then stimulated to produce insulin, and that amount of insulin will match the amount of glucose that's there. So this would be a case of a slow releasing glucose level. Now when it reaches the muscles and is allowed to circulate, here comes insulin to match onto the receptor there. Now this is a non-demanding muscle, but we're calling the glucose transporter to the surface and making it take glucose, and this is what we want to do in the hours before exercise, to fill up our muscles with glucose. Now we won't worry about insufficiency just yet, that's something we'll get to a bit later. So insulin's simple role is to clear excess blood glucose from the bloodstream. If it's dumping into the bloodstream at a very fast rate, it will do that very quickly in a panic situation, and unfortunately that would often lead to fat cells opening and packing of the excess calories into the fat cells. If the glucose release is slower and more drip-fed into the system, then insulin will be produced, but will simply travel alongside glucose through the bloodstream, getting to the muscles, unlocking the muscles that are not having an active demand for glucose at that point, and packing the glucose into the muscle, which is where we want it for exercise later. So when it comes to food choices before training, the first thing you have to consider is how much time do you have before you start exercising. If you've got a very short amount of time before you start exercising, you'll want that blood glucose to occur quickly, that rise in blood glucose. So you would opt for more simple or high GI carbs. If you've got more time available to you and you want a more complete fill up of muscle glycogen and liver glycogen stores, then you'll eat slower releasing low GI carbs, which will allow the filling up of those glycogen stores over the hours before exercise. So it really depends on how long you've got. Ideally, your pre-exercise eating should begin around 4 hours prior to exercise. Okay, and it should be spread probably over 2 intakes in that time. Because your body's not actively demanding carbs at that point, we don't want to create that insulin response. So we want to be eating predominantly low GI carbs. Okay. We could also include a little protein at that time to ensure that the carbs are released in a drip-feed fashion. That will avoid the spike in glucose and avoid the rebound effect of the high insulin response. It will also allow the glucose to circulate to resting muscles where insulin will give it access into the muscle cell. And that way we store up our glucose for our session that's coming later. The whole aim of our pre-exercise feed should be to optimize our muscle glycogen stores and our liver glycogen stores. Now after exercise, your muscles do want carbs, and they want them quick. That little transporter that was called up to the muscle cell surface when insulin bound into the receptor is already there waiting. He wants glucose and he wants it now. So we need to take advantage of that window of time as athletes and make sure that we are feeding the muscle at that point with some carbs. Now the post-exercise hormonal environment is actually quite low in insulin, and it's not optimal for getting glucose into the cells where a demand is occurring. So we could actually utilize simple carbs at this point to drive more carbs into the muscle for replenishment. So to maximize glycogen synthesis post-training, you want to create a high insulin environment. And for that, you want to eat high GI carbs. And there's been a load of studies that have confirmed that eating high GI carbs in that window of opportunity post-training, it says within 2 hours there, I would suggest within 30 to 60 minutes to be even better, then that is our window of opportunity to eat some simple carbs. And this is often the best meal of the day for a lot of athletes, where you get to eat something that normally in your diet, if you're trying to stay lean, etc., wouldn't be there. Now we also know about the benefits of adding protein at this time. So adding protein in combination with carbs is shown to further increase the insulin response and help shuttle both carbs and protein into the muscle, which will maximize recovery. Alright, so that's a good place to leave it today. We'll continue on with this talk about high carb and low carb diets. We'll talk more about eating of carbs around exercise, and we'll start looking at some numbers around that. And even more importantly, we'll start looking at your intake of carbs and what you should be eating for the amount of activity you're doing. Thanks for listening in, and check out lesson 2 coming up soon. Cheers now. Bye.